good evening, and welcome to the Writer's Room. Yes, you heard me right. It's the Writer's Room. It's a special feature we do right here on Wrestling with the Future, quickly becoming one of our most popular features. Talking a lot about writers and authorship these days, and we have the creme de la creme tonight. When you talk about authors, and I said it before, I'll say it again, he's got more books out there than King James. Our guest tonight is, if you'll notice behind me, just a smattering of some of his writings, just a little scattering of some of the work that the great Scott Teal has brought to us. And Scott Teal is our guest. He's a returning guest. He's my old buddy from Gallatin, Tennessee. Scott, how are you, my friend?
Man,
what's shaking in the great state of Tennessee?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Just as you said earlier, I'm up to my eyeballs with work trying to get this Buddy Rogers book out. And
and
rolled
we're
in
talk
today
about
on the
Buddy
truck
tonight too. We're going to talk a lot about Buddy, and we're going to kind of segue into that book and sell even more books for you because you're not busy enough. So now, Benny, since you're a returning member of the family, I am going to let you have at it with the first question. Go for it, brother.
Well, I have a little bit of a statement first, Scott. I don't know if you've ever been to a restaurant called Fogo de Chao, or if you've ever heard of it.
No.
It's one of these places, all you can eat, but it's really, really good meat. Like prime rib, filet mignon, sirloin, you name it. And they call them gauchos. I call them meat pirates. But they come around with these skewers, and if you get this little disc. If the disc is green, if the green side is up, they'll keep serving the meat. And if when you get tired, you put it on red, and they stop. And yeah. I remember my friend Paul and I did, when I lived in Minneapolis. We went there, and we both had the meat sweats for 3 days. But my whole point is, it's like one of these places where you want to stay there for a week because there's just so much good stuff.
We have been to one of those. There's a place in Nashville called Rodizio Grill.
Yes.
That's
very similar. Yes, sir.
It was awesome.
Yeah, same thing. And my point is, like, when I go to CROWBAR Press, like, book-wise, it's the same thing for me. There's just so much good stuff that I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And then my question was, I was going to get another book because I'm looking for another one to read, and I was going to get the Oli book. And then when I clicked on the website, I saw the thing for Buddy Rogers. So you have one more order that you got this afternoon.
Awesome. It should be in the mail tomorrow.
I guess as a wrestling fan, I don't really know that much about Buddy. I know that he lost to Bruno in 1963, and he kind of disappeared after that. And does this book get more into like what happens afterwards?
Yes, it sure does. It talks a lot about what happened afterwards, sort of brings you up to date of what happened after Bruno. And there's a lot of stuff about the match with Bruno and the circumstances behind it, how it all came about, Bruno's reaction towards winning the belt. A lot of good information in there. The Buddy Rogers, even before that in the book, there's a lot of things that I never heard before. Tim Hornbaker, the author, dug up so much great information about Buddy from a child all the way up till he began wrestling, and it's really fascinating. One of the things I learned is that Buddy isn't quite the guy that everybody painted him to be. Buddy, a lot of people paint him to be egotistical, refusing to put guys over, but he was anything but. He never hesitated to do a job. Now, he may have argued, we don't really know that, but he's not quite what people, made him out to be. And I think that's one of the strong points of the book.
I will tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, Scott, and I say this, I always preface it by saying the interest of full disclosure because I'm going to speak truth now. I knew Buddy Rogers. He was my neighbor. In fact, I knew him very, very well. I knew him as a wrestler and as a friend and neighbor. He was also the guy that my father bought his bar off of. My father bought Buddy's bar in Camden, New Jersey. Yeah. And I've mentioned it on the show many times. Buddy was was well known in South Jersey, especially in Camden, where he grew up. He was a police officer in Camden, New Jersey. Buddy was a really sweet guy, a very generous guy, and people don't know as much money as he made, and he made a shit ton of money. Don't kid yourself. He made a lot of money, but he gave away a lot of money. And a lot of people will never know that unless you are from this area. You don't know of his generosity. He was a very, very generous guy who gave away thousands of dollars to help people out. Scott, let's talk about, I don't want to get too much into the weeds with the Buddy book because I want people to buy it. So we're not going to talk too much about what's in the book, but let's talk a little bit about authorship. Benny will tell you that the last 2-3 shows we've done have had authors. I've had Nick Christophers, the famous noted mafia author, great guy. We've had Javier Hoist from Pro Wrestling Stories, a publication that Benny actually writes for. And we've done a number of interviews with George Anastasia, the Pulitzer Prize winner. Some heavy hitters in the literary world. Among them, Scott Teal. What goes into writing a book? Explain the discipline that goes into writing a book. Do you start with a premise, an idea, or thought, or are you given these things to work with?
Generally, it's not really doesn't start with an idea. It starts more with something that interests me. Say I call Stan Hansen, and I think Stan Hansen would make a great book, and I usually think about why it would make a great book. Stan Hansen was in Japan for so much, and people have a fascination over here with wrestling in Japan, both past and future. So I thought, well, Stan would have a lot of good information on how the business worked behind the scenes, because we don't hear much of that. We read about the matches and some of the things that happened, but not exactly how the business was run in Japan, because it was quite different than it was in the States. As far as my historical books, I've had interest, like say for Knoxville or Amarillo. I wanted to know more about the early days, so I put out those great wrestling venue books where it talks about the history of Amarillo from the early 1900s all the way up till till they quit promoting there. That kind of thing fascinates me, and that's really where the ideas for the premise for my books come from.
Interesting that you mentioned Amarillo in your dissertation, because I spoke to the king of Amarillo just 2 days ago, Terry Funk. I was on the phone with Terry for about an hour. And, thank you, Mr. Funk. He's going to do our show.
Well, awesome.
So we're going to have Terry Funk as a call-in guest on our show.
That's awesome.
But now it's interesting. Another thing tying right into Amarillo and the territories, writing about that. For example, we just had Eddie Mansfield on the show and Scott Casey. And it's unbelievable that the history that has not been recorded in written form. It blows my mind, Scott, that someone somewhere hasn't taken the time to archive and document. Just if you just took Texas wrestling alone, just Texas alone, forget about, New Mexico, the rest of the Southwest Territory, Oklahoma, Texas, of course, which is like, its own territory, basically. Mm-hmm. There were 7 territories in Texas.
Right.
Why has no one jumped on this, and did I just give you an idea?
Yeah, you mean as far as writing a book about the Texas territory?
Yeah, or even the Southwest in general. No one to date has ever archived or written about that territory. The Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma. No one.
Michael McCurdy, I understand, is writing a book on the Dallas territory. He's working on it.
Okay.
The different part of the problem is wrestling being so secretive, and the fact that there really isn't a whole lot of information available to the fans. That puts a lot of people off as far as writing a book. You can't go. It's like football. They have all these magazines, all these information about football that was out in the open. But wrestling was pretty secretive. They didn't let people know. So There's not as much information. And that sort of leads in what I'd like to say about Tim Hornbaker, who wrote the Buddy Rogers book. We are two different styles of writing. And I'm not saying his is bad. What I'm saying is Tim can take a subject like Buddy Rogers, a guy that's dead, and do amazing amount of research to come up with a great narrative about Buddy's life. I mean, details that most people could never even find.
Right.
It amazes me because he's done the same thing on the territories. He's done the same thing in several of his books about, it's just strictly history. I don't know how he does it. I've had people ask me, how come you don't do a book on, say, Jack Pfeffer or Buddy Rogers or whoever? Well, they're dead. So you mentioned Scott Casey and Eddie Mansfield.
Sure.
They're both alive.
Yeah.
So that's what I go after. What I want to do is books about these guys because they were there. They know the stories. They know the history. They were actually there and experienced it. So before I begin writing about some of these guys that are dead, I'm going to talk to as many of these guys that are still alive as I can, because when they're gone, we lose all the history. We lose all the stories.
And you know what, and Scott, and thank you for segueing right into something you and I actually spoke about before. Now, Benny, if you watch the show that Scott and I did with Nikita Brezhnikov, and thank you for watching it. One of the things that we talked about, Scott, in that show, in that episode we did, was the secretive nature, was the fact that how do you validate the veracity of someone's story who isn't here anymore? And you remember we spoke about that.
Yeah.
The other thing is, now that you've actually have someone that's doing that, it's interesting to see their take on it. Would you say that you're a guy who likes to archive the history of the moment to preserve that moment for future generations? Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's my whole goal is there's so many guys that have passed away. Well, Freddie Blassie wrote a book, but it wasn't to me, it wasn't all that detailed. But guys that have passed away, John Tolos is a good example. He never did an interview with anybody. And there's countless guys like that have never, told their story. So, yeah, it's very important that as I said, we talk to these guys before they're gone, because we do need to preserve this history. And that's my whole goal. It's not selling books, that's for sure. I mean, if I wanted to be a big, make a whole lot of money selling books, I'd be writing about football or something.
You're right.
Oliver can tell you the same thing. He's writing about hockey.
Thank you for saying that. It's interesting that you say that. It's really, really interesting you say that, because there are more. But Benny and I spoke about this the other night on the show. There's more being written about wrestling right now than actual wrestling, which is a scary thought.
Yeah.
There's nothing happening. I mean, literally, Scott, nothing happening in the world of wrestling. But yet, it's never been a better time to read about wrestling. There's never been a better time to write a book about wrestling, because I think, and this is just my analytical mind, is that I think because there's such a lull in it, I think people are craving for that sense of nostalgia, and that's what you're seeing being written about. Certainly in your books, and that's what I love about your books. My friend Nikita Brezhnikov, you might be familiar with him.
Yeah.
You were on the show with him. This is Nikki's book, When It Was Real, co-authored by Scott Teal, by the way. Hell of a book. Great book. One of the things about Nikki's book, and we talked about this before, it was written from a fan perspective. He had enough insight into inside the business to include some of that. But like myself, Nikki and I are the same age, and we grew up in the same area and the same genre of wrestling, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Benny, you're a guy who's written. You have a few articles out there on the internet. You've got one of the masters here. Go for it, brother. Talk.
Well, it's funny you guys are like, it's almost like you read my mind here. One of the questions I have written down is,
I'm a psychic. You know that?
We're pretty much the same age, thereabouts. I was born in 1955.
2 years
So
before.
not that I look it, but we read and we write about these these wrestlers, the stories, the ribs, the road trips, the territories, and like a 30-year-old fan, 30 years from now, I'm wondering what are they going to write about? They're going to write about Ryback or something like that. Like what are they going to write? I mean,
absolutely.
He's
Yeah,
got
it's got, Angelo has, I'm sure 30 years from now, he can write stories about his experiences. You may have had experience with some of the wrestlers and not being on the road. But other than that, I'll guarantee 10 years from now, most of the guys are going to be gone that was in the territory era. They're going to be either too old to talk, or they don't remember. They're, having health problems. So it's really important that we absolutely do as much as we can and talk to these guys as often as we can. I know I sound like a broken record, but I constantly telling people, it's like Nick Bockwinkel. I wanted somebody to get with him and just pick his brain for everything he knows. But Nick passed away before anybody did that. And that's a shame. The Crusher, man, I would love to interview Reggie Lasowski. Man, what a story he could tell.
Yeah.
So many guys like that, that we could have talked to, but now we've lost that opportunity. And all the memories they have, all the history of like Bruiser promoting Indianapolis. I mean, he promoted.
Oh my God! You just took the words out of my mouth, Scott. You just took the words out of my mouth. Dick the Bruiser. In the interest of full disclosure, the Bruiser's son-in-law, Scott Romer, is a friend of mine, and I know you know Scott as well.
Yes.
Here's a guy. If anybody's going to write a book about Dick the Bruiser, it had damn well better be Scott Romer.
Right.
And
there's been one written. Richard Bycheck wrote Dick the Bruiser book, and I published that one too. And it's awesome. He did a job just like Tim Hornbaker did for Buddy Rogers. He took Dick the Bruiser, and it's amazing the amount of the facts that he came up with and was able to uncover about Dick.
Well, in that regard, again, we talked about on the previous episode. If someone is passed, you've got to rely on either one of two things: either the truthfulness of their statements, or you've got to somehow validate it. Yeah. With regard to Buddy, I can tell you factually, because I know this, that there are still quite a number of people alive and well who can validate Buddy's story. And several of his stories. I am one of those people. I know what happened when Buddy lost to Bruno. I know those. Of course, he and I have talked about it. I know what happened in those missing years, and why he came back with Jimmy Snuka, and why he came back to put the tights on again at the age of 60. It's not something he did that he wanted to do, but he didn't forget who created Buddy Rogers. It was Vince McMahon Sr. And as a favor to his son, he did the favors.
Yeah.
And in the process, he created one of the biggest stars in WWF history, Jimmy Snuka.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say, Benny, that before this point, relatively few people knew who Jimmy Snuka was. He was a relative unknown.
I tell you what, that Rogers Corner, when they had Lou Albano,
exactly,
and Jimmy, and Jimmy turned face, to me was one of the most epic moments in wrestling TV history.
And my point, exactly.
Did either of you? A question I have for you guys: did either of you have the opportunity to actually see him wrestle, or see him wrestle live in his prime?
I have, yes.
I haven't.
I have. Although Benny's a bit older than I, just a few years, I was, my home from the age of 6 was the Philadelphia Arena at 45th and Market Street in Philadelphia. I saw Bruno wrestle Killer Kowalski, wrestling as the executioner because he couldn't show his face. He was wearing a hood because he had just broke or busted off Yukon Eric's ear. And that's when they started calling him Killer, because they thought he killed the guy. If you remember, that's a history lesson. I saw Buddy wrestle a few times. I saw him once in his prime and once as an older guy at the Philadelphia Spectrum. In fact, I saw him twice at the Spectrum. But the Buddy I knew was more Buddy Rogers, the person. Because I lived right next. I mean, when I say he was my neighbor, you could leave my door and go into his door. He lived right next door in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So I knew him as a person. He was a good guy. He was a straight up guy, but he was a no nonsense, no bullshit kind of guy. He's going to tell you the way it is. He's going to give you a piece of his mind if he needs to. And he instilled that in the people he mentored, people like Doc Diamond, people like Larry Sharp, all guys that, you know, if you ever had the chance to interview or speak to Larry or Doc Diamond, it's just you're listening to Buddy Rogers when they speak.
Right. Absolutely.
You know?
Frankie Kane, I just came out with the Frankie Kane book a couple months ago. The second book, he has a lot of Buddy Rogers stories. He was around Buddy Rogers when Frankie was when Frankie was a teenager, and got to make some trips with him. He tells some hilarious stories about things he said to Rogers and what Rogers said back to him. And
I can imagine.
So, but you see that you asked me what hits my hot button on what I want to write about or who I want to talk to.
Yeah.
You telling what you just told about being around Buddy Rogers, living your, have some connection with him. You're type of guy I'd love to do the interview with, because you would have information nobody else has about Buddy Rogers. You were
and I do.
Yes, and
I'm
there's
surprised
things you know that other people probably don't.
Yeah, I'm surprised no one's contacted me. I've been contacted, truthfully, and I'll go straight up. I've been contacted by other authors and have contributed to other books.
Yeah.
No one has ever asked me to contribute to a Buddy Rogers book. British Bulldog, to contribute to a Bret the Hitman Hart book. All people, by the way, who I knew marginally.
Right.
But I knew Buddy. And people
see,
know that.
The reason is, I'm sure Tim Hornbaker would have talked to you, would love to have talked to you, but he probably didn't realize the connection.
Oh, I'd still like to if he wants to. Benny, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, because I heard the last interview, and Scott, I think you said you started watching wrestling in 1968.
Yes, sir. That's right.
Okay. And you grew up in the Tampa area?
Yep, just below Tampa, in a place called Bradenton, small town.
Okay, Bradenton?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'm in Newport Richey. I'm probably about an hour from there.
Oh, yeah. I know where Newport Richey, yep.
So, I mean, my magic moment was in 1967 for Christmas. My parents got me a Hitachi 12-inch TV, which I proceeded to bring up to my room. And then, after Christmas, and I was, messing around, and I saw this UHF dial, and I started messing with it, and I hit channel 47, which was, I think, WNJU, channel 47 from Newark, New Jersey. And by chance, it happened to be on Saturday night, and I found Capital Wrestling with Ray Morgan.
Oh, wow.
And I was your heart. I was hooked.
Yeah.
I was hooked at that moment, and I was just wondering, what was your magic moment?
When I first started watching, that first day, that first show I watched, and I explained that story about, being at somebody's house and everybody went in to watch wrestling. And it was the Gladiator, Ricky Hunter. He was under a mask. And what happened was he had won the fans had given him a watch because he was such a good guy. They loved him so much. And during the show, all of a sudden he comes out. They're carried Joe Scarpa out. It was Wahoo McDaniel, and I can't remember who the other one was. But anyway, Joe Scarpa was all bleeding and bloody. And all he could say over and over was, I tried to stop him. I tried to stop him. I couldn't. I tried to stop him. What had happened was the great Malenko and Hans Mortier, the hated heels at the time, and I mean people hated those guys.
Oh, boy.
They broke into Ricky Hunter's locker, the Gladiator's locker, to get the watch. Well, Joe Scarpa, so this story goes, tried to stop him, and they bloodied him up. That just absolutely caught my attention. And within the next few weeks, Jack Briscoe got his hair cut by the medics. They caught him, caught his arms in the ropes, and they cut a bunch of his hair off. Dick Dunn. That I can never forget that. Dick Dunn was the good doctor. He was the manager of a mask manager of the medics. This was before Dr. Ken Ramey came along.
Yeah.
And Dick Dunn was in the ring as the good doctor, and I believe it was Briscoe got in the ring and pulled the mask off, and I can still hear Gordon Soley. I can hear his words, his voice in my head saying, "It's Dick Dunn, it's Dick Dunn." I'll never forget that. But those right there, those things right there, if I never saw anything, that hooked me on pro wrestling, and I never looked back. It aired 2 times a week. It aired on Saturday night, and it aired on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. It was the exact same show, but I watched it both times every week.
My come to Jesus moment was 1965. You mentioned Ray Morgan. I'll throw a name at you. Bill Cardell.
Chili Billy.
Chili Billy Cardell. Yep. Studio Wrestling from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That was my moment. That was it. It was after that. The fat lady sang, Benny.
I tell you what, if somebody found the archives, like some film of that Studio Wrestling, they'd be a millionaire.
Oh my God! I wonder if any of that stuff still.
You never see it. I've looked on YouTube. I can't really find much of anything. You find
you're not. You're really not. You know what happened though? Back in those days, and it's funny, Scott. Maybe if you've come across this too, in the Tennessee southern area, they used to bicycle the tapes.
Yeah.
Which literally means that they would record over them.
Well, bicycling really meant they'd send it to the Tampa TV station.
Yeah, it would go.
And when they finished, they'd send it to Fort Myers, and they'd send it to Fort Lauderdale or wherever.
Yeah,
and
they would literally send it to different towns. Yeah.
Yes, and when they got through bicycling, then they would tape over it.
Exactly.
And I can understand that. They cost a lot. And something else I've said, people say, I've heard people say about Ole Anderson, how dumb he was to get rid of all those old films, those old reels of 16 millimeter film. Well, you stop and think, when one 16 millimeter film reel, an hour film reels is like this.
Yeah.
Now you figure 52 of those every year. Plus, you don't have to save the duplicates you made, but even if you save just one a week for 52 weeks, you think how much space you would need to save all those things. I mean, eventually you need a warehouse.
I'll tell you who bought a bunch of them and who still has them. Jim Cornette.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And there is
Jim
a guy
Cornette bought a bunch of them.
A good friend of Ole's that owns a lot of the old 16 millimeter stuff from Georgia Championship Wrestling. And I don't know if he's got it in a warehouse. I don't even know if the guy's still alive. I talked to him about it a few times, but
I could tell you, it's interesting that you talk about that, because I know that one of the guys who I know personally who has ownership of quite a bit of that original footage is George Pantis. And I don't know if you know George or not.
George is in Virginia, right?
Where did George get it?
He recorded it.
George's a great guy.
He was literally the film guy. I mean, it's a lot of it's 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter film. It started off as 16 millimeter, and then as time progressed, he got the super 8 millimeter, the first version, I suppose, of the handheld camera, if you will, because it was a lot more compact. But George Pantis owns quite a bit of the footage, the film, the video, the photos. He bought the rights to a lot of the photos. Another person to talk to about that is Peggy Lathan, who has a lot of that archive stuff. But these are names that you can find all over the place. They're
I know Peggy.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Oh, everybody knows Peggy.
Yeah.
She's the first lady of wrestling, really, if you want to think about it. So when we were here last time, and we left off at a really good spot that I can pick up on now. Talk about getting inside the writer's room, and by the way, and just to backtrack myself for just a moment, When we last spoke on the show, you said when you have Kenny Casanova on, ask him about that Vader story. I did have Kenny on, and we did, in fact, speak about that Vader story. And he said, yes, Leon was a pain in the balls.
Yeah. Yes, he was. And I'm glad I left him behind. I'm glad I dropped that idea.
Yeah, Kenny's a great guy. He's a terrific guy.
Yeah.
A lot of fun, too. But let's talk about getting in the head of the writer. Now, Benny, you're a guy who writes, okay? When you, and I'm doing this for comparative purposes. When you write, Ben, do you have a subject matter in mind, or do things hit you spontaneously?
To me, it's a combination of both. Like right now, I'm actually working on a story about Dominic DeNucci, who's another guy and he was a guest of the show. In fact, I'm going to ask you for some help there, Angelo, on that one.
That's what I'm here for.
The guy is, I think he's going to be 90 years old in January.
Yes.
And you could probably listen to that guy for a week straight, 168 hours, and he probably wouldn't repeat his story. And
he's got enough of them. God bless him.
And you guys, we're talking earlier about preserving stories and, the history. And there's one right there.
2 hours.
Absolutely.
Scott, I had Dominic for 2 hours, and he didn't tell the same story twice.
Awesome. Well, if you have the questions, you could talk to him probably for 2 days. You could probably.
Oh my God, please.
Hours.
Oh.
Now, not everybody can do that. There's some guys that people say, well, so-and-so would have made a great book because he was main event everywhere. Well, that's not true. There's guys I've talked to, Mongolian Stomper, Archie Goldie. I talked to him. I had 18 pages of questions. I asked him every question, and we ended up with an hour and 45 minutes worth of stuff. Some guys just don't have they just don't know how to tell a story, or they don't remember, the stories. But then you got other guys, and I use J.J. Dillon as the example all the time. You put in a quarter, and he'll talk for an hour.
I love J.J.
He remembers Frankie Kane.
That was a very good book too. I read his book. Excellent book.
Thank you. Frankie Kane's the same way. I just published the one book on him, and there'll be a second volume coming out. And it's funny. We were down there with Frankie and his wife just a month ago. I went down, took a bunch of books so he could autograph them. And when we were sitting there, we sat there with them. We had dinner with them several nights, and then during the daytime, I'd spend it at Frankie's house talking with him. I wound up with 6 pages of notes, and I'm not talking about when he tells a story, I write out the whole story. I'm talking about if he tells a story about Buddy Rogers and going to Toledo, Ohio, and he tells us 15-minute story, I just write Buddy Rogers going to Toledo, Ohio. And that's it. That's all I wrote down. And I have 6 pages of just that kind of notes.
Wow.
What I'm going to do is call him, and I'm going to say, okay, we're going to start recording. Tell me about Buddy Rogers and the car ride to Toledo, Ohio. And
Beautiful.
Let him tell the story. I'll guarantee almost those 6 pages of notes, he's probably got another half of a book. It's amazing.
I believe it, brother. You mentioned J.J. Dillon. He's been on our show, God, a half a dozen times already. I love J.J.
Yeah.
His book, there's a couple of books that you guys worked on that were different. Of course, Nikita's book was different because it comes from the fan perspective when it was real. JJ's book, JJ is a guy, like you say, you put a quarter in the machine, he'll talk for an hour. But JJ's one of those guys that's very detail-oriented. He remembers everything.
Yeah.
Where did the title of, because, you don't think of a wrestler book associated in any way, shape, or form with seagulls.
Right.
But where did, wrestlers like seagulls come from?
It was a direct quote from Vincent McMahon Sr. And I don't remember the circumstances, but somebody asked him something about some wrestler, and he says, that's the way the wrestlers are. All they do is squawk and blank like a bunch of seagulls. And that's where that came from. And I would have never thought of using that title, but JJ, he says, we need to use that title. And I said, at first I thought that just does, I was like you. I thought, that doesn't sound like a wrestling book. How is wrestlers are like seagulls going to sell a wrestling book?
It's funny, though.
It was perfect.
It would not only was, but it's a hell of a book. A hell of a book. I love that book.
Thank you.
I've read a lot of your stuff. You don't know that, but I troll you, brother. Benny, go ahead, brother. I want you to have the opportunity
All
to.
right.
to
Well,
Let me ask Benny. Let me ask Benny first.
Go ahead.
I'd like to know what you've written and where I can find some. I'd love to read some of the things you've written.
I'm catching up to the rest of the world. I've written a couple of stories on ProWrestlingStories.com. One is it's called Campo del Sogni, which is Italian for Field of Dreams, because I met Bruno Sammartino at Rico's in Pittsburgh in December of 2017. A few months before he passed away. I actually had Christmas dinner with him. And it was just a dream come true. I mean, literally, it was my field of dreams. And I wrote about that. And then I wrote another one I called it The Time Machine. I was actually I believe it was the November 1969 issue of The Wrestler, The Wrestler magazine. They used to have a pen pal section.
Yep.
And, you put your little, I had my little junior high school picture in there.
Oh, awesome.
With my address, which up until 2 years ago, you could have still mailed me a letter, and it would have got to that address because that house was in my family for years and years.
Oh, that's
cool. Just said who you wanted for pen pals. But back in the day, that's what you did. You wrote to each other.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I wrote about that as well, and I'm gonna write about Dominic because that's still from the heart. But I think after that, I want to stretch it a little bit. Like Javier Oyst, who was on the show last week, who's a phenomenal writer.
I know him. Yeah.
I want to.
Yeah, Javier's a great guy. Great kid.
It's something where maybe I don't know that much about it, but I have to stretch and do some research and try to come up with something. So I want to try to expand myself a little bit.
Yeah, that's the key, especially like when you talk to Dom DiNucci, and if you ever decide to do a book or even a lengthy piece on Dom, do a lot of research. That's what I do. These guys, it's funny because almost all of them, at some point in the interview work, and I'll do anywhere from 15. If I'm doing a book, I'll do anywhere from 20 to 80 hours worth of work as far as interview work. But they always tell me, they say, man, how do you find that? They just can't believe I know all this stuff about them, but it's because I get in and I dig through the old newspaper archives. I dig through magazines. And it's funny you mentioned this pen pal, the pen pal column. That's where I got I never had my picture in a pen pal column in the national magazines, but I did have an ad in there for a little newsletter that I published. It was a few years after I started watching wrestling, called the Tampa Scene. And that's where I got my start. Wow. And I was just recently looking through a bunch of old magazines, and I probably ran across your picture because I have a lot of them, and it has all those pictures. And I'm looking to see and I found a few of people that I know now that I didn't know before. And here's this picture of them when they were like 15, 16 years old. It's really cool to see that. Against some of them were, even ended up becoming professional wrestlers.
Well, I think Taz was in there. Peter Sinerka, I think his name is.
Yeah.
Funny stuff. An awesome thing to think. How many people get their picture in a magazine that is sold on a newsstand nationally? I mean, that's really cool. That you've got your picture, and that's something a lot of kids, brag about. Say, look here, my pictures. It's pretty neat.
Well, and
that's the only. I don't know. Maybe other magazines did it, but I think wrestling is probably the only sport that actually did anything like that.
And you know what? And it really does. It's a unique form, whether you want to call it a sport form, an art form, and whatever you want to call it. It really is a unique genre. To have, again, to see your name in print and to hear someone tell a story about you is flattering. My friend Jimmy Valiant wrote about me in his book, which I have a copy of that as well, which was very flattering. And I've known Jimmy for 35 years. Yeah. But Benny, I want to get back to you for a minute because Benny is selling himself really short. He told you about sitting down with Bruno and having dinner, but he didn't tell you about how it came about. So go ahead and tell Scott the whole story now.
So I have a friend, Mike Mygat, who was a fan of Bruno's and actually became a very close personal friend of his. And Mike and I had been friends on Facebook, and it was around early October 2017, and I posted something on Facebook. It was a tribute to Bruno for his birthday. So Mike called me and said, I'm bringing Bruno out for his birthday. Would you mind me reading your tribute? I said, would I mind? Are you kidding me? Like, of course. And he goes, well, don't be surprised if you hear from him, if he calls you. I said, yeah, right, sure, like, whatever. I'm thinking like there's a better chance of me waking up with black hair tomorrow than that. And I was working at a car dealership in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. By the grace of God, I wasn't busy with a customer. Right at 6:00, my phone rings, and Mike said, Benny, there's somebody who wants to speak to you. And like, nobody can imitate Bruno's voice.
Right.
And my heart almost stopped like right then and there. And I'll just remember what he said to me was, Benny, where did you learn to write those beautiful words? And I said, Bruno, when you write from the heart, it's easy.
Absolutely.
And we chatted for a while. I mean, it was a dream come true right there. If it had ended right there, it would have been perfect anyway. But, Mike called me about a week later and said, Bruno really liked you. They're having a big get together at Rico's for Christmas. Would you want to join us? And within a half an hour, I had my plane ticket bought, my hotel room booked, and I already requested the PTO from work. Nothing was gonna, even death wouldn't have stopped me from being there. And I mean, like I said, besides my kids being born, probably the greatest night of my entire life.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny when Angela was talking. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Scott, that's why I wanted Benny to elaborate, because it was all perpetrated by something he wrote.
Yes.
So words are important. Words are critical. Do you give great thought and great weight to the words that you write and how they will affect people? Or do you just put it down and let the chips fall where they may, like a lot of people do?
Yeah, no. A lot of my books are based on, I do the interviews and then I write the whole book. I take what they told me and I write it in a form as if they wrote it, I couldn't write a book like that if it wasn't for the guys, if they didn't tell me the stories and share all the information that they have. But at the same time, I take what they wrote and I'll change it a little bit, change words to make it more fluid, to make it sound, to explain what they're trying to, say a little bit better.
Right.
And it's like Frankie Kane. You won't believe the files of words I have on Frankie Kane. I've got at least one more book and probably a book and a half, but it's incredible. The hardest thing for me right now is taking everything he's told me and moving it. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle. I'm trying to get it all pieced together so it flows from 1961 all the way till he quit. Well, actually, all the way to today. It's hard to do that, but yes, absolutely. Words mean a lot, and you can tell a story in a certain way that it has a whole lot more meaning, or at least it explains the meaning, a lot better than this if you just put down whatever they said.
We talked the last time about the sometimes combative nature of wrestlers and how they can be. Oftentimes they can be difficult. Sometimes they're not real bright, and you have to extract from them like being a literary dentist.
Yes.
Have there been people that have come to you, or have people come to you on behalf of other people and said, Mr. Teal, we think there's a great story here, a great life story. We'd like you to write this. And upon reviewing it, you said, no, I can't do this.
Yeah.
Has moments like that happened?
Yeah, and there are some guys generally what I do is I'll say, let's do a little bit of talking. Let me ask you some questions, and we'll see if there's a possibility of a book. Most of the guys aren't. They'd love to have a book with their name on it, but some guys don't have enough information. They don't have enough stories to have a whole book. And what I'll end up saying is, listen, I think you have a great story. Let's get talk as often as we can, get as much information as we can, and we'll use it in my Wrestling Archive project. And in my Wrestling Archive project books, I have anywhere 16 to 18 interviews with the guys. At that point, they realize they don't care so much that they have a full book, but what they're more interested in, I help them realize that, is that their story is told. It doesn't matter if it's 60 pages, if it's 100 pages, their story is being told. And a lot of guys, their whole story that I'm able to get out of them is told in that 60 pages. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you can, depending on your use of vocabulary, and what you put behind it, you can take a story that would fill a 400-page book, and just using the right vocabulary and verbiage, and cut out, as Benny would say, just the meat, not the filler.
Yes.
On 150 pages, it will tell the same story, as a book that looks like the New York phone directory.
Yes, absolutely.
My first book, Psychic Fingerprints, was 150 pages, 149 pages plus the inside cover sheet. My second book was 127 pages and was more well received than the first one.
I'm interested in that book, Angelo.
I'll give you a copy.
That's the one that has, the mysticism and threaded in with the theology.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
You'll love it.
That sounds very interesting.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, it's not always about page count. I had a guy one time, an author, who said, he wanted his book to be, have a bigger font, so it's 300 and some pages. I said, I don't want a bigger font. I said, I want a book that's in whatever font, which preferably the font that I use, because I try to make my books uniform. But I want the story as much. If that book takes 300 pages to tell the story, great, we'll have 300 pages. But if it takes 150, 200, that's fine, because people are going to enjoy it. But if you just start throwing stuff in there just so you have a bigger book, or so people think you've got a bigger story, they're not going to. You're going to get bad reviews for one thing.
Well, it's ego too. I mean, let's be honest, Scott. It's ego. Somebody wants to be able to, to pick up a big, thick, heavy book.
Yeah.
Nikita Brezhnekov's book, 285 pages or 290, somewhere around there, right? But within that, 300-page book, you've got probably 700 or 800 pages worth of stories.
It's packed
absolutely
with information.
Because it's packed.
Yes.
It's really packed. You and Nikki did a hell of a job of editorializing that book. That's why whenever I refer to, the definitive wrestling book, it's got to be when it was real by Scott Teal and Nikki Brezhnikov. Think about it, because it's all encompassing. It's the fan speaking, but that fan happens to be a guy who got lucky enough to work in the business for a good period of time.
And he thinks exactly like 90% of the fans who watched those same matches at the time during the 70s. He is exactly what a fan would have been during that time.
Yeah,
I want to correct something. You said that I co-authored the book with Nikita. A lot of the books, a lot of the books I wrote myself, because I interviewed guys. I did tons of research, dug it out of them, like you said a little while ago. But there's other guys like Nikita, Tim Hornbaker. I've got my name on there because I added some bit. I added some things Nikita's. I rechecked Nikita's research to be sure all the dates were correct. And yes, I added some things, corrected some things, but I didn't do enough on that book to be considered, a co-author. I am. Well, let me ask you a question. With Scott Teal.
That's a really good point. Let me ask you a question from a maybe it's a technical question, but it says with Scott Teal. Now, that means that you were involved in it in some capacity.
Yeah.
Does that differ from co-authored by?
Yes. Co-authored is two guys working together on a book, pretty much.
Okay, gotcha.
Now, there's also a difference between with and between an editor. A with is a guy who adds things to expand the narrative, who finds out things that the author didn't know and adds that in there. A with is a guy who also does research and corrects a lot of things. Now you have an editor. An editor pretty much goes through and just corrects grammar errors or typos and looks for things like that. Maybe a little bit of flow, how the story flows. Say, okay, how about we change this word here? But so there's almost three different types of writers as far as helpers for other writers.
Yeah.
Like I said, you got your co-author, you got your with, and you got your editor. And I'm sort of like the guys on the old wrestling posters. I'm sure you guys remember One Other Match.
Oh, yeah.
I'm with Scott
One
Teal.
Other
I'm
Match.
just sort of a sideline. Okay, I'm just sort of filling out the card.
Or if they didn't have enough room, they would put and more.
And then
Right.
more. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. How much involvement did you have with Mike Hornbecker and this Buddy Rogers book?
Tim Hornbecker.
Tim.
I did a solid edit on it. There's a lot of, not a lot, but there wasn't hardly any corrections to be made as far as research. Some of it I trusted Tim, and I really didn't check it all. But Tim has been proven on his other books that he's an ace when it comes to doing research. Yes, I found a few things. Yes, I change words because I have a certain way of, I want things to flow.
Yeah.
And I did change, I'd say, quite a few sentences. And it wasn't the content of the sentences, but it was the way they were worded. Or maybe he put something at the end of a sentence and I moved it at the beginning to make it flow better. But Tim is a writer's writer. And I went into the project a little bit worried because a lot of guys, they tell you, I'm not really a writer. If you can make it sound better, great. Well, Tim's a writer's writer. He knows what he's doing. And he was just absolutely wonderful to work with. Me, personally, if somebody did to me what I did to Tim Hornbecker as far as wanting to change grammar and sentences, I'd probably been offended. I would think, I've been writing for, 25 years, and you're going to try and tell me to change this sentence. He never balked. Now, there's a few things he said, well, I'd prefer to leave it like this because of so-and-so. I'm good with that. That didn't bother me. It's not going to change the whole scope of the book or anything. But he was wonderful to work with. And you know how people are. It'd be like a wrestler. You telling a wrestler, you should have done this in the ring.
Yeah.
They're going to take offense to it because they know their job.
Yeah, that's going to go over like a fart in church.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. So,
Tim was
how apparently the book is well received, judging by the fact that we almost canceled tonight's appearance because you're so damn busy.
Yeah, we're quite under the gun right now.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to keep you too much longer. I do have a couple technical questions, though.
Sure.
The name says Crowbar Press, right?
Right.
So when somebody writes a book, do they solely accept responsibility for the content of that book, or do you, as the face and voice behind Crowbar Press, are you ultimately responsible for what your and their name go on?
It's sort of a mixed bag. It's really both of us. I don't even remember if I have anything in the contract that I use with authors, whether I have anything in there that says that they take the sole response. I'd have to look that up. I don't even remember because I don't use the contract most of the time. But I don't remember. I could have something that says the author takes responsibility for any remarks made or any content.
Right.
But even if it said the publisher has no responsibility, no liability when it comes to anything said, any libel or anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. If somebody wants to sue you, they're going to sue you. And if they want to come
well, and that's you just went there. You just went there because here's the thing. The last time we spoke on the previous episode, you, I, and Nikita got into a conversation about just that, the liability factor. How, again, it's how do you prove someone's liable if the person you're writing about is no longer here, or if someone is being referred to that's deceased. Who do you sue? It's like Kenny Casanova said, who do you sue?
Right.
If they're dead, who do you sue?
Right. I've wondered about that myself. It's like Rocky Johnson. All that fiasco. His books off the shelf. Yeah. I think it's funny, but we were
at length. Yeah.
We were in Virginia last week with Charlie Thez, Lou Thez's widow. We were spending a week with her, and we went in a bookstore while we were there. And right on the bookshelf in the sports section was the Rocky Johnson story by Rocky Johnson with Scott Teal. And those things are selling for big money online now. But I will tell people this: there are bookstores that still have copies on the shelves because they didn't return them to ECW Press when all this went down.
Well, yeah.
So yeah, and I've got probably another whole book of stories that Rocky told me that wasn't even included in this book. I could publish another whole book, but my question is, could The Rock come along and sue me? Say you can't publish this stuff about my dad. I don't know if I have the right to. I always wondered if I do an interview with somebody, and I'm not talking about being sued for libel, or saying something that wasn't true, or them saying I didn't say that or whatever. I'm talking about, can you actually publish an interview you did with somebody, or do you have to have their permission, especially if somebody was alive? That's a
really interesting question, and very topical and very timely. I was approached, and I will say this on the air because it's out there, so it's no secret. I was approached by a young woman to help her author a book on Rocky Johnson. You know who that young woman was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know about young, but
yeah, we're not going to mention her name.
Right.
And I told her categorically, undeniably, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I'm not touching that one with a 39.5-foot pole. To quote the Grinch.
Yes.
And not because I didn't want to contribute to her book, but I didn't know and do not know now whether the authenticatability of that book is in dispute. Right. How do I know she's not just making shit up?
Yeah.
And so, as a way of protecting myself, I had to say no. You, on the other hand, have information from the horse's mouth, which makes it a whole different story. I'm not, a legal brain trust, but I could put you in touch with one who knows this stuff when it comes to literary. Because that's a whole nother a line of law practice.
Yeah.
Dealing with authors. That's a whole different ballgame. But I would just say off the top of my head, you're probably safe.
Yeah.
Because
I save, for one thing, I save all the audio recordings. I save my.
And there you go. Like that's it right there. You got it on tape.
Most of them have I've got timestamps, tells what time they said different things, so I can look it up if I need. Rockies, I didn't do so good a job keeping timestamps, but I've got it all.
And here's how you get away with it, Scott. And here's how you get away with it legally. You write down the title of the book as told to, by Rocky Johnson, as told to Scott Teal.
Right.
And that's how you get away with that. And it's legal, and nobody can dispute it.
Right. Now, they could dispute it even so. It's like I said, if they want to sue you,
lose.
They can sue you. But then, they may lose, but it still costs you time and money. And I've been really lucky because the guys, I got started doing interviews in 1996. I think it was 96.
Yeah.
I knew all the guys because I had traveled with them. I was in the business. So they felt comfortable opening up to me. And that was during a time when the wrestlers weren't opening up with anybody yet. So I was really lucky to have that opportunity. But I've never had anybody, I would say 100% of the guys I've done interviews with have been just absolutely super happy the fact that I even had an interest in representing their story in print. Because they just didn't believe anybody cared about it. I've had wrestlers tell me that. Says, I've been out of the business since 1975.
Yeah.
And I didn't think anybody even cared who I was anymore. I said, you don't know. These guys, these fans, they remember. And they love these stories.
Yeah.
They love to know more about you. And it's hard for them to comprehend.
It's funny you say that. My friend Scott Casey almost verbatim uttered those words when Nick Massey wrote his book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One Last Ride, the tales of Cowboy Scott Casey. Benny, we're going to say goodnight to Scott. So I will give you the closing salvo, and you can usher Scott into his living room so he can finish packing up orders and books.
Well, Scott, this is a totally random question here. On your website, you have something. I think it says other. I can't even remember the category. I clicked on it,
Other
and there's
publishers.
two books. One is Before Durango, and the other one's Durango. I think it's by
yeah.
Chuck Thornton.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, why they're there. It was so random compared to everything else.
My friend Chuck Thornton is a big wrestling fan in Atlanta. I mean, he's a collector. He has stuff, just unbelievable collection of wrestling memorabilia. And he just called one day and he says, I'd like to do a book on Charles Starrett. Now, Chuck, he's a big collector also of old Super 8. You remember in the old comic books and magazines, they used to get Super 8 movies of the Tom and Jerry cartoon or
sure.
And it was only like 3 minutes on these little reels of Super 8. Yeah. Well, he collected all that stuff, and he collects movie posters, movie pictures. And he has a lot of stuff on Charles Starrett, who played a character called Durango in the old westerns. And he wanted to do a book on Charles Starrett.
Oh, my God.
It's pretty much a photo book is what it is. I mean, there's information as well. He's got synopsises of the films. But I am a huge film buff. All my life, I'd go to bookstores, and first I'd go to the sports section. Well, I didn't really go to the sports section. I go to the magazines because that's where the wrestling magazines were. Sports section, they didn't have books on wrestling because they didn't write books on wrestling back then. They didn't want all that stuff out there. So my next stop in a bookstore was always, what was I talking about? I had a senior moment.
Movies.
What's that? Movies, yes.
Movies.
Was the, what they call performing arts section of a bookstore.
Yes.
And I love the old books on the movies. They'd have like a book on Charlie Chaplin, all his films.
Yeah.
So, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, all their films, and it have synopsis. Little Rascals. I love that book by Leonard Maltin that came out.
Oh my God.
It's called Our Gang. Oh, it was awesome because it had pictures of all their films and the information about it, and it was so cool. Well, when Chuck contacted me, I thought, yeah, I'd love to do something like a film book. It's something I've never tried before. So we did that. We did the Durango book first. And after we did that, he contacted, and I really did it as a favor. I mean, I haven't sold very many at all, but he just wants to get the pictures out there, get the information out there. And after we did the first one, he came back one day. He says, I'd like to do a second one on Charles Starrett, who was Durango, but in his other films where didn't play the character. So I said, yeah, let's do that. Well, his next project, and I'm excited about this one, is on Amos and Andy, the old television.
Oh my God, yes, sir.
So I am pumped about that one. As I said, I'm a movie buff. I love it, and so I'm looking forward to getting started on that one. He's getting things together on it now, and I've got to talk with him first. I'd sort of like to include some of the old information about the radio program. I've got all the comic strips from the newspapers back. I can't remember what years they were, probably the 20s and 30s.
Yeah,
they had a comic strip, Amos and Andy. So
at least
I'm hoping that comes about, that he keeps working on it, and that I eventually get to do that.
Remarkable. I hope so too. I would love to see something like that.
Yeah,
amazing. The website is CROWBARPRESS.com. Scott Teal is the man behind that master machine. If you have a wrestling book in your house, Scott Teal's name is in it, on it, or he wrote it. And that's just as simple as that gets. There's hardly a book ever written that doesn't have Scott Teal in it, on it, or wrote it.
I appreciate
the book is the Buddy Rogers book. Promote the Buddy Rogers book, by the way.
Yeah, it's just out. We just got them by truck today. They came in, and as soon as they got here, we started unpacking them. My wife's been shoving them in envelopes. I'm printing labels and printing postage, and we hope to have all the orders. Today I only had time when the truck got here. I only had time to throw 3 copies in an express mail envelope to Tim Hornbaker, the author of the book. And tomorrow we'll be mailing out. We've gotten around 250 orders in the past 3 days.
I apologize to adding to your workload there, Scott.
Oh yes.
Well, I'm gonna add to your workload because I'm gonna buy mine.
Awesome. Well, that's
Can
great.
I ask one more question, Angelo?
What's that?
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Yeah.
I feel like Peter Falk, Columbo. Ma'am, just one more thing. I almost forgot. Somebody like me who, in my head, I want to write a book one day. Like, do you accept manuscripts from people? And
Yeah. Sure do. I mean, if it's about wrestling.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. If it's something else, I'd consider it, like the film books. I love that. I probably wouldn't do a fiction book because I just don't have the market for it. People that buy my books are the people that know about wrestling. They know about me, and so I have a fairly steady clientele of readers. But I consider anything, and it's never been about money. I've written books, and I'll use a couple examples because I've talked about it with them, and they understand, and they say the same thing. But it's like Duke West. He was a guy that wrestled in the 70s in Indiana, maybe lower Michigan, Ohio. He was and I say this nicely, a nobody, and he admits it. Mm-hmm. He was just a little guy that his biggest claim to fame was one television show. He wrestled for Vern Gagne up in Minneapolis. That was the only time he made. That was the biggest he ever got. And he did a job. He lost the match, but to him it was awesome to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But this guy had such a fascinating story of being a little guy on the road, just traveling from town to town to wrestle. I was fascinated by it. And it took me 2 years just to make, I don't remember how many copies I ordered, maybe 200, but it took me 2 years to sell enough copies to make my money back on what it cost me for that printing of the book. And it's done okay. It isn't a book you'd ever write to make any money. But again, it's about preserving exactly what Angelo said. It's about preserving the history. I don't care if it's a big seller or not. I've never looked at trying to find main eventers. I mean, I've written books about the guys that were in the main events. I've had guys come to me and want me to write their books, but it's never been about that with me. A lot of times the main event guys don't have as good a story as some of these lesser known guys, the opening match guys, the preliminary wrestlers. They've got fascinating.
It's funny you say that because on the episode we did with Dominic DeNucci, we had a surprise run-in call for Dominic from one of his road buddies, Bruce Swayze.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't know the name Bruce Swayze. You and I do.
Yes.
Benny may not even. I don't know if you know that name, Benny, Bruce Swayze. But Bruce traveled the world wrestling.
Yeah, sure did.
All over the place. And a lot of people don't know him.
Right.
And we're going to have him on. I'm going to dedicate a whole show just to Bruce. He's one of those guys, Scott. Fascinating guy that you never heard about.
Absolutely. I've written those wrestling archive projects. They're strictly interviews with guys, but a lot of those interviews are coming from my 53 issues of my old wrestling, Whatever Happened To magazine. Right. And I have interviewed with guys I'll guarantee neither one of you have ever heard of. But they are interesting. They're fascinating stories as they tell about their time in the business.
Yeah.
So I enjoy doing those. I've had people tell me they enjoy reading about those as much as the more semifinal, the main event guys. Because those are guys they never heard of. And those guys saw a side of the business that the main event guys never saw. They saw the hardships,
Absolutely.
Just barely be able healing 4 or 5 guys into one motel room, cramming 6 great big monster guys into a car to make the town because they didn't have.
We talked about that when Larry Zbyszko was here. 5 guys, 6 guys sharing a car, throwing the box spring and mattress, So somebody would have, extra places to sleep. It's crazy. Absolutely. Scott, I got to let you go. I'm going to let you get back to your to your orders. Thank you so much. Please come back again when all the orders are out.
We're ready.
And you're in a lull between bestsellers.
Yeah, right.
Because I would love to have you back again. Scott Teal is the man behind CROWBARPress.com. He's the guy whose name is on your book. Somewhere in your house, his name's on your book.
Thank you all very much.
He wrote it.
I really appreciate you having me on the show, and I
thank you.
Come
Scott.
back anytime you'd like. If I can help you in any way, don't hesitate.
And likewise, if there's any info you need from me, I've been around a long time, brother. I worked for WWF way back when.
I still want to bring that guy on your show that I talked to you about.
Don't tell me, just surprise me.
Okay. You just let me know when you want to do it.
After all the books are out.
Okay. Well, that's going to be forever.
Right.
Until I'm gone. Oh, you mean the ones I'm shipping out?
Like the end of January, maybe like the 3rd week of January.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
Thank y'all.
Scott Teal, thank you so much. Have a good one, my friend.
Nice to meet you,
Y'all
Scott.
too. Take care.
Scott Teal, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Great one. That was a great
Wow.
interview, Benny.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So you're going to get a manuscript out to him. Maybe
Well-
you got something in the works here? Are you the next big thing with it?
It's something I've always wanted to do, and I love wrestling. And what really impressed me about him is, he's not in it for the buck. He's in it because he loves to write about wrestling, and that's kind of the same thing with me.
Yeah.
If I got a royalty check for $1, I'd frame it because now I'm a published paid author. That dollar would mean something, and that's all I really want. I just want somebody to say, hey, that was a really good book you wrote.
I got news for you. It's funny when he was on the first episode. We had was me and Nikita Brezhnikov and Scott were here, and we were talking about and Nikki and I were like dumbfounded that our names are actually on books. He goes, I can't believe my name is on a book. I said, yes, scary, isn't it? Think about the fact that I wrote books, crazy stuff. But the funny thing was that in my case, and they didn't get rich from it. Nikki and Scott, they don't get rich from this stuff. When you're making pennies on the dollar or whatever the case may be, but certainly you're getting paid for it. In my case, my book actually cost me money because I didn't charge. I gave it all. I gave them all away. And you know what? I'd do it again too.
But you liked writing it, though, right? You enjoyed it.
That was the whole thing. That was it right there. That was the whole thing. I enjoyed the process of writing. I wasn't sure if I was spelling words right. It was a challenge, and then you're sitting there for hours on end. Your eyes start going goofy, and you start seeing things and witches on broomsticks, and
then you reread it and say, did I really write that?
Yeah, exactly. Or you start saying to yourself, did I write that earlier in the book? Am I repeating myself?
Exactly.
Then you have to go back and double check your own work. Because sometimes these stories run into each other, So, what is going on in the world of Scala from Ocala?
Working from home now, at least for the near future, which gives me time to do this and, spend some time writing, which I'm eternally grateful for.
Good. Well, you have a new article that's going to be popping up on Pro Wrestling Stories on Dominic DeNucci. When can we look to see that one?
Well, I think his birthday, I'm not sure. I know it's in January. I'm not sure the exact date. I think it's around the 12th, maybe. I could be wrong.
That sounds about right.
So I'd like to have it finished before then, just, kind of like a birthday present for him.
I'll tell you what, let me just check something real quick. I want to check my schedule real quick. 'Cause if that's the case, boy, I would love to have him on the show with you.
I guess his health's a little bit better, and
well, he's in great shape.
Yeah.
He's fine.
I think he's more bored than anything else right now, so maybe that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I know what he's got a little bit of property. He goes out and tends to his garden. He walks every day. He goes to the YMCA every day.
Does he still work out?
He's still working out. Yeah.
Wow. Unreal.
He's amazing, this guy. He's like the Energizer Bunny. No, he's in great shape. But yeah, I think I'll have him back on with you, and you can read your article to him, or tell him about your article.
Yeah, I think he'd really.
I'd love to have him on there with you. Sure. Well, so Benny can be found on Facebook, Benny Scala. They just look for Benny Scala.
Look under Benny Piano Wire too, or Big Ben.
There you go. Exactly. And of course, ProWrestlingStories.com. You got a couple of articles up there. I think about 2 or 3 of them, right?
I have 3. I'm credited for 3. I only really wrote 2. One I transcribed an interview, so 2 legit. And this will be my 3rd. But I'm kind of hoping now. I got to catch up to Javier.
There you go. You better work overtime, brother.
Yeah.
And for us, we are at Wrestling with the Future. Now, let me tell you where you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, of course, and Twitter. And let me tell you where you can find us on each of these places, because it does vary a little bit. On Twitter, we are at Wrestling Future. There's no G in that. At Wrestling Future. On Instagram, we are at Wrestling with the Future. On Facebook, we are facebook.com/Wrestling with the Future. And we do have a public and private page. Now, you'll get more content on the private page, obviously, and breaking news on the private page that you will not get on the public page. If you want to send us a show suggestion, comment, or have something to contribute, you can email us at wrestlingwiththefuture@gmail.com. We do answer everything. Sometimes it takes a little bit because we get a little busy, but we do answer everything. Tell you what's coming up this week on Thursday night, the return of Stephen Plim. Stephen Plim, you ask. He was the manager of Tiny Tim, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. He will be back with us this week, Thursday night. Next week, we've got a big week. We have, let me just make sure I get it right here. I'm going to get my schedule, Ben. Forgive me for leaning. Next week, we've got Mary Kennedy from the television show Shameless. You've seen her there. Also, you've seen her as part of a really fascinating Broadway Tony-nominated show called Afterglow. It was a musical tribute to the Glow Girls from pro wrestling's Glow era. And Mary played Sylvester Stallone's mom, Jackie Stallone, in the show Afterglow. And she'll be with us on the 15th with Nikita Brezhnikov. He'll be here. That will pretty much do it for December, because we are, as I mentioned before, we do have an abbreviated month this month because of, the holidays and Thanksgiving. I mean, for Thanksgiving, Christmas and all that stuff. However, right after the first of the year, we're going to get busy again. We've got, you know her as Mad Maxine, again from Glow. Mad Maxine is Janine, and I still can't pronounce her name, so I'm not going to try to. It's Janine. Well, we've got also in January a fascinating guy returning, Nick Christopher, and he's bringing a very special guest with him, alleged mafia hitman who worked for John Gotti. His name is John Elite, or pronounced Elite or Alite, depending on how you want to pronounce it. John will be here. He will be with us on Skype from an undisclosed location and somewhere in the world, we don't know, but he will be here to talk about his alleged involvement as a mafia hitman working for John Gotti. Nick Christopher's book, Prison Rules, is about John Elite's life. Also, our friend George Anastasia wrote a story, in fact, a whole book on John Elite called Gotti's Rules, a best-selling book that's garnered the attention of John Gotti Jr. None too happy about either of these guys. But apparently what they wrote is they have a right to write it. John Gotti Jr. will be invited to be a part of this show. If he accepts, that's great. If he declines, that's okay too. But in the interest of full disclosure and in equal opportunity, I have to invite all the parties involved, because that's what we do. We're fair here. That being said, we got a lot coming up. And I will be talking to Dan the Man and Big Ben. They will be taking over the wrestling portion of the show, as I will be handling all the non-wrestling stuff. So the guys are going. I'm giving it to the younger generation. Well, the semi-younger generation. Don't start with me, Ben. Oh, shit. Anyway, we're going to say goodnight to everybody. Have a great night, everybody. Happy wrestling. Be good to yourselves. Be good to each other. And keep on keeping on. We're all going to get this. We'll get through this together, and we'll be all right. All right.
Do you have sweaty balls or volleyball netty balls? It's time to make them ready balls. The Manscaped.com Lawnmower 3.0 will do the job and clean your knob with its patented no-nick head, so your head will function as desired. Enter promo code WrestlingFuture for a generous 20% discount. That's enter WrestlingFuture for a 20% discount. Manscaped.com and Wrestling with the Future, going balls to the walls with Manscaped.com and the Lawnmower 3.0. Your balls will thank you, and so will we.